right, hello everyone, and thanks for clicking into our pets and housing conversation here. I'm Ross Barker, the program director for the Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative, and I am really excited to be joined by a couple of very special organizations today, um, representing My Dog is My Home and Noah's Animal House. And I'm going to kick this off just by asking each of our guests to introduce themselves and their organization, and we'll go from there. So, Shoshana, can you start us off, please?
Hi, I'm Shoshana Mostoller, and I work for My Dog is My Home. I'm the storytelling facilitator and technical assistance specialist. I've worked in animal welfare really for about 10 years now, and I recently transitioned over to My Dog is My Home, which is more on the homeless services side, really connecting the two things. So I'm a veterinary social worker. I work with the human side of the human animal bond. And really, what My Dog is My Home does is we advocate for the co-sheltering and co-housing of people with their pets. We're a nationwide nonprofit organization. We really work on the program level, so we don't provide any kind of direct service. We primarily work in three different ways. We have a storytelling program that really offers people with lived experience of being unhoused with their pets an opportunity to advocate for themselves and what they need and want and would like to see. We also work providing technical assistance to homeless service providers on how they can incorporate pets and become pet inclusive. And then, our last thing is we really look at ourselves as community builders. We like to bring together animal welfare with homeless services. So we have a co-sheltering collaborative that brings together animal welfare organizations and homeless service organizations to work together to further co-sheltering in their communities. So those are the things we do. We really just believe that pets are family and that people shouldn't have to choose between their family and housing. So that's our big push.
That's great.
Mhm.
Marlene, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Hi there, Marlene Richter. I'm the executive director of Noah's Animal House. Noah's was the inspiration of one of our community's leaders. She asked the question of a domestic violence shelter at the time, what happens if a survivor shows up with a pet? And the answer was not one shelter in the country at that time, 20 years ago, could receive both. And so 18 years ago, she opened the first co-located animal sanctuary on the grounds of the domestic violence shelter. And I joined the agency right after that. So for 18 years, I've been a part of the journey of families and individuals of all ages showing up with their pets, healing together, staying together, and then moving out together. And now we're also a trainer for the federal government's OVW, Office of Violence Against Women. And we get to train other agencies to do what we do. And then I'll let Maggie talk a little bit more specifically about that. But 8 years ago, Noah's Animal House went statewide. And so now we have a facility in Reno, which is 400 miles away from the original location here in Las Vegas. So we serve the state of Nevada and have welcomed the people from 37 states to our programs because they wanted to stay with their pet. It matters that survivors have the choice to be with their pets. And I'll turn it over to Maggie.
I'm Maggie Harris, and I am the peer trainer at Noah's Animal House. As Marlene mentioned, I'm funded by that federal grant, and we've worked with, as of right now, 36 domestic violence shelters or domestic violence organization adjacent who are wanting to transition into being pet inclusive. And it's with the help of some of the people on this Zoom right now, we've been able to make a really big dent across the country in the number of shelters who are able to be pet inclusive, no matter how small or how big. And it's been an incredibly rewarding experience.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, everybody, for your comments. And I really want to just first thank you all for being here. As you started to talk about, and we'll get into it more, each of your organizations is working at this intersection of housing and crisis response and the human animal bond. And so those are the things we want to get into. I know you've also talked about pets being family. That sort of transcends all of this work as well. So love to hear more about that as we go into it. So we've kind of thought about a bit of a title for this being a safe place for both of us. And you've made some references to that kind of dynamic in your introductions. So I want to ask a little bit more from each of you. What does a safe place for both of us mean in terms of the work that you do? And what happens, second part to that is what happens if that kind of place doesn't exist? So how about we start with Maggie? I'll start with you. I'm just kind of bouncing
Uh,
around.
a safe place for both of us looks to me um, as a place where you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose your own personal safety or that of your family or your pet. And since so much of the time the pet is also abused, it's taking everybody, the family. You know, my dog is my home, and that is family. And we've seen so many instances where people had no idea that this was even an option, and so they chose not to leave on an interpersonal violence situation. So to be able to provide that, and we know that the likelihood of people staying out of a interpersonal violent relationship if they have their animals is significantly higher.
Marlene, what would you say, or anything you would add to that, or your own personal perspective on it?
When I first saw Noah's Animal House and saw at that first glance, I just started to cry because seeing the survivor cuddling a cat, sitting in our cuddle room with their dog and their cat and their children, and the relief on their face was substantial. So if you're at the front door as they arrive and you see this completely distraught person who's clinging to hope that there's something better, and then you see the instant moment that the relief happens because they're snuggling with their pet and they're both safe. They're both healing. They're both able to stay together, be together, and then hope for the future together. So it's structurally safe. The campus is safe, and the interior is meant for emotional safety as well. So physical safety and emotional safety are a part of what I describe as both are safe.
What do you think, Shoshana?
Yeah, it's interesting because, with My Dog is My Home, we work with domestic violence organizations for sure, but we also work within the homelessness space. And I guess I would like to start off by saying, just that belief that everybody has a right to a safe and secure home. And, that should not, there shouldn't be people who don't have access to that with or without a pet. Then when you add a pet in, it really is a barrier to people being able to access what services are available. So, it's making sure that that pet doesn't become one thing in a long line of struggles that people are already trying to overcome in order to find housing and a safe housing is really what the goal is.
That's great. And you're all really referring a lot to this, the bond that people have and how in offering services, the ultimate goal is to take care of the families and the individuals, but that often is kind of linked indelibly to a pet with a pet, right? And so it's kind of keeping the family together in that sense. So I want to go back to something that you said, Marlene, earlier. You talked about 20 years ago when this first started, when Noah's first got going, looking around, you didn't see any shelters that would accommodate both domestic violence shelters that would accommodate both people and with their pets. What's caused the change? It's not like it's not perfect now for sure, but it's there's a lot more than there were. It's a lot more than zero now. And so, what do you think has led to those positive changes? And this is up for all of you if you have thoughts on this, but Marlene brought that. I'll start with you, Marlene.
I really have to point to our founder, Stacy Alonso. When Noah's opened, she began capturing the story. So I was the executive director of the programs, but she's the storyteller. She was the one who said, let's remove the barrier so that they can come in. That was the goal, is make it safe for the human to enter the shelter and not to have one more thing, to Shoshana's point, not one more thing keep them away. And then the stories and the successes began immediately, side by side, to people that did not have a pet and people that did have a pet. And all of a sudden, the recidivism rate went to 1%. I just ran 2025 stats. 1% recidivism rate for survivors of domestic violence having to come back again because they exited with their pet, stayed with their pet, and moved out with their pet. So she told the story, she took the pictures, and it was relatable. People who had pets understood, oh my gosh, I would not want to choose either. So in a culture where still they're asking, why doesn't she just leave? When the answer became she couldn't, or she shouldn't have to choose which life to save. Once that became the better together conversation, people started to take notice. And the interviews that Stacy did with Women's Day magazine and with news and with, at that point, there was a lot of written publications. Then it just, that's why the people came from the other states, because they went, oh, I would rather leave Boston, Florida, Texas, and keep my pet. It mattered that much that they could stay together.
I love that point about the storytelling in terms of changing minds. I think it's absolutely critical that we get people's stories out, and that also we allow people who are living that experience really make sure they have the opportunities to advocate themselves for the things that they need. People are not going to remember statistics that they hear. What they're going to remember is how they felt when someone shared their story. And I think, that's really what makes very significant change in how we look at animals whose owners are experiencing homelessness. Lots of times when someone's experiencing homelessness or domestic violence, we really other them, right? Like that's not us. We don't really, stories really allow us to humanize that experience and to relate to it in a much more tangible way. And I think that we need to really continue to push the stories out of people who are really having these experiences if we want to see substantial change.
It
That's
really
great.
is. It's a big part of our program with the grant is the storytelling and giving organizations the tools is a better way to say that. To be able to do that and understand the impact of it is you're reaching a whole new audience of people who could, be volunteers, who could donate, who could, all sorts of things. And I think, so much of the time when I explain what I do with Noah's, it just happened over the weekend, someone will say, gosh, of course, that makes total sense. Of course they're not going to leave without their pet. It is that emotional pull that statistics don't do.
When I started working in animal welfare about 10 years ago, there really was a sense of if people can't afford their pets, they shouldn't have them. And it's been really exciting to see that mentality change because the truth is, and studies bear this out, like the animals of people who are experiencing homelessness are well cared for, well loved. It's not really a thing that people shouldn't be able to keep their pets. There are supports that we can put in place to assist people. And I think the more that we can get the word out that these animals are loved and well cared for, and that the community can see that as well, is really going to continue to help make that change in attitudes towards people who are maybe experiencing a crisis with a pet.
And pets are also such a big part of mental health, such a huge part of that, and even physical health. If you pet a dog for 5 minutes, your cortisol goes down significantly. So that's kind of the other part of it is they're part of the healing and they're part of I have someone to take care of, that gives me purpose.
The other side of that is if you lose your pet, the trauma and grief that goes along with that
Mm.
isn't always acknowledged, right? So, like, in the veterinary social worker in me is going to say, like, any pet loss is disenfranchised grief, but specifically, if you're having to surrender your animal to a shelter, are you going to share that experience with other people? Are you going to be ashamed? Are you going to feel guilty? Are you going to be able to connect with other people about what that experience is? And then, are you going to wonder the rest of your life what happened to your pet? Are they okay? Did they find a home? That type of ambiguous grief, the health benefits, we all know there's so many health benefits, to Maggie's point of having our pets with us. But the other part is losing your pets is significant grief and trauma and guilt.
Several of the children that I've worked with over the years, if you listen to their story, excuse me, the one thing that they regret the most is that they did have to leave and leave their pet behind. Out of all the things, they left everything else to come into a shelter to escape. The one thing that continues to haunt them is that they left their pet behind. And that could be 20, 30, 40 years later. They just feel so responsible that they're safe and their pet was not. So those stories, I think they make the difference. Anybody can relate to not wanting to choose.
So the storytelling is definitely a through line through all of your work and really important. And we work a lot with data, but we're often saying, here's the big picture, right? Here's what the difficulty of rental housing looks like in your particular community, right? Here's the number of places, here's a percentage of places that don't allow pets, here's a percentage that don't allow breed inside. So that's data and that's helpful, but we also recognize like the value of the story is so important because it's so compelling. I'm wondering though, where do you see the barriers still lying then? I mean, because the stories are working in a lot of ways, but so where does that not change minds? Not that it's a criticism of the storytelling approach, but I mean, but when you're telling stories and we're getting a lot of people to recognize the importance of pets and family being together and having a safe place for people. But certainly there's limits because not every we're still trying to get this done. So where do you run into barriers with getting that story to resonate?
I think the barriers are all the things that, and I'll list some of them that Stacy said when she started all this is, okay, what do we do to fix it? And I think that's the mindset you need to have. Allergies, breeds, barking, bites, all the things we think about, space, where do you put them? Where do they interact with people who are fearful of pets, right? But this, and I'll go back to what you said earlier. In my opinion, Ross, the statistics are every bit as important because there are people who are decision makers who need to justify a decision statistically based on facts, right? So we have both parts of the story, but it's a mindset of what do we do to remove it? What do we do to remove it? And that's the DNA of Stacy and people like her.
Yeah, I really agree with Maggie's point. I think it is both the decision makers are going to want to see statistics. We all know certain barriers. Maggie just listed a bunch of barriers that are the ones that we typically hear, right? But then there's also systematic barriers. There's access to vet care. There's a vet care shortage, a veterinarian shortage right now. So access to affordable vet care is a barrier for sure. I think, we really need to see the collaboration of animal welfare with homeless services if we really want to see co-sheltering succeed. Because it's really hard to co-shelter if you don't have a veterinary partner. But animal welfare has its own system. Homelessness services, they have their own systems. And we're seeing homeless services being under attack right now. Funding is being taken away for basic, like permanent supportive housing. We're seeing drug programs losing their funding. And so sometimes it's hard to focus on animals, which seems like a little bit of a niche topic when your whole program seems to be under fire. And so I think, one thing in terms of the barriers to keep in mind is that it doesn't have to be as hard as people think it is. And that's where like really highlighting successful programs is helpful because we can show like this program does it, they're doing it well. It doesn't have to cost a fortune. It doesn't have to be difficult. If if you get assistance, technical assistance, and you get help with your policies, It doesn't have to be as hard as people think it is going to be, but at the end of the day, the big barrier to me is just the fact that homeless services is under attack already. And, animal welfare organizations typically do want to help, right? They don't want extra animals that already have homes. Like they don't want to find homes for owned animals. When I worked in animal welfare initially, I was heartbroken sometimes when we'd have to, have people come in and they'd bring their animals and they didn't want to have to surrender them, but they had a housing issue or whatever type of issue. Like those animal shelters would rather help you to keep your animal if they can. So we really just need to be having some of those combinations to connect animal welfare with homeless services, with domestic violence services, so that everyone can work together because truthfully, it doesn't have to be that expensive. It doesn't have to be that difficult. We see programs, successful programs all over the country that are doing amazing work with very little. People who work for nonprofits in general are so resourceful, right? Because we have to be. We don't have a lot of, typically, we don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of people. We don't have a lot of anything. So you make the best with what you have. And so, it's we have to start making sure people know that it's not as hard as they think it's going to be.
Another thing I would add to these categories, though, it's top of mind for me is insurance. It's the number one thing we're hearing about homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, transitional programs, permanent housing, all of the landlords, property management, everybody's saying, but our insurance. And there's a smaller and smaller number of insurance companies that will provide liability and comp and worker comp insurance if there's an animal there. So they're even splitting the industry between animals that are up for adoption and owned animals. It's getting very tricky to make sure that that you're meeting the legal protections of being a business owner, a property manager. So that's the other thing. We made a lot of strides on the insurance and the breed restrictions, but it feels like the coin just flipped right over. And now this insurance issue is honestly, as soon as you said what's the barrier, insurance.
And we are
That's
seeing some states that are making changes
yeah.
with that, right? So, like Colorado recently passed legislation that actually, really makes it regulates that insurance can't deny insurance based on breed or based on size. And so, I think, it is some of those barriers can be addressed probably more easily if we really look at legislation. Unfortunately, it might have to go that way with a lot of these issues, I think.
I agree.
And it's such a big education piece. When we had our first convening with our grantees last year, and Ross and Sarah spoke, and I mean, there was a lot of, oh, I didn't know these things, and that's a big part of, I think, what Marlene and I are doing is the education piece, just to say, you can do it. Here are the tools, and and there's organizations out there like Pet Inclusive Housing and My Dog is My Home and others that are there to help.
It's interesting how much information is out there, yet we don't always know about it, right? And we get focused on, naturally, we get focused on the things that we're doing day to day, and there's other information out there that if we can bring it together, it could be potentially more powerful. I think, Marlene, you said something about animals as a niche topic. How do you deal with that? I mean, because I think we notice that too, right? I mean, and it's almost like you have to justify why you're talking about animals sometimes, right? When you're talking to a human service provider or a housing activist group, right? Or like when we deal with housing, we deal with serious policy issues, right? And boy, so you bring animals to us and we don't know what to do with that. And I try to explain to them this link, right? It's a bond, right? And so if you're really trying to take care of your community and the families and the individuals in the community, that it's also the pets, right? So it's not just an animal issue. And so, but I mean, do you have thoughts about how to, like in your storytelling or your discussions, how do you move, how do you try to move that from a niche topic to a like, we need to be looking at these together?
I think one thing is to look at it. This is sort of back to something Maggie brought up before, but look at it as an indicator of health. I don't think this is just going to be me, but I don't always know the names of my neighbors, but I probably know the
Mhm.
names of their dogs, right? We're out walking. I mean, it's true. When I lived in Illinois, when someone I worked with was like, "Oh, someone lives in your neighborhood and they know who you are." And I had no idea. And then they're like, "Oh, it was like a husky." And oh, yeah, I know who they are. And
Yeah.
so I think whole communities are healthier when we're out walking, when we're talking to our neighbors, when we're pet sitting for our neighbors, all of those things. We really should be lowering barriers in general. And whether that barrier is that someone has a substance abuse issue that they're trying to deal with, whether that barrier is a pet, they're all barriers. And so it's not so much, is it a pet issue? As much as it should we be making it as easy for people as possible to get the services they need, whether it's pet, whether it's some other barrier that's holding them back. How can we make it easier for people? And then, like as we've been saying this whole time, pets are family. So people shouldn't have to choose. And, I think most people understand because they have their own pets. But what they might not know is that someone who's in experiencing homelessness actually, and studies have shown this, actually have stronger attachments to their pets than housed people because they're in crisis and they need that stability and support more than ever. And so, it's just, we really have to stop looking at it as this is a pet and this is a person, but just looking at it as a cohesive unit, as a family, and as a community. The individual, the human, and the community are all healthier when pets are healthier. And then we could go into a whole One Health model
Mhm.
discussion. I mean, there's so many ways you can go from
Right.
that.
I'd like to add something to that. I do two things. And the first is statistical, which is according to the insurance industry, 67% of American homes have a pet.
Mhm.
So, of course, 67% of the people that become unhoused or are escaping violence or on any of those other tragedies that are happening are going to have a pet. It's not us, them, it's us. We, 67%, have pets. So I just think that, if we think of it that way, and then Maggie has seen me do this over and over when I'm speaking in public, raise your hand if you have a pet.
Mhm.
It's that instant, oh. And then most recently, just in working around trauma, and the stories that came out when we as a world were locked down and we as a nation talked about how comforting it was to have a pet. I talked about during the times of COVID and how comforting it was to have that companionship and to have that opportunity to exercise and to have purpose each day because of their pet, while the rest of the world was literally from day to day and unknown. And
Mhm.
so I still reference that because people remember how afraid they were and how comforting their pet was.
I think people do get it, right? Like when I think it's about being able to fund it. It's about being able to help, help with policies. I think most people do understand it. The lead COC agency where I live asked me to do a presentation on how people in homeless services could work with pet owners. And when I was done, I asked if there's any questions. We had a few questions, and then we stopped. And then there was a line like to the I mean, pretty much everyone stood in line to talk to me. And I was like, this is so weird. Why is everyone standing? And like, I asked if there were questions. We had some questions. We dealt with the questions. No, they wanted to show me pictures of their pets,
Yeah.
right? So I think people get it, but they're just concerned. They're concerned about some of the stuff that Maggie mentioned earlier. Are there going to be bites? What do we do if someone has an allergy? Like they're concerns.
Yeah.
So then the discussion is, not that we want to minimize someone's concerns, but the truth is those are the concerns that every organization that successfully co-shelters has or
Mhm.
had, and they all got past them. And so then it's like, yes, like I want to listen to your concerns. I'm not minimizing the things that you're concerned about. But what I'm saying is we have systems, we have plans, we have organizations that are making this work, and we can show you how they did it. And so it's not as scary as people initially think it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that's something that we talk a lot about as well, right? I mean, it's kind of using that same phrasing. It doesn't have to be as scary as you think it's going to be, right? Here's what's work. I want to go. I mean, so you've brought up the liability part again, and that Maggie mentioned and Marlene talked about insurance. So let's go back and talk about that a little bit. Think about insurance, and that's an issue. And yet there are several providers that have figured it out. So what would you say, what have you learned about those experiences from those that have figured it out that you could share with ones that are struggling with it? What would you say about insurance to those folks and or about liability in general terms that maybe would make them feel less anxious about these changes?
I think it's important for people to talk to their broker and not assume that there's going to be issues. We have had some organizations whose insurance were really worried about it, but most of them actually weren't that worried about it as long as you lay out these are what our policies are going to be, these are how we're mitigating those concerns. Like we're not acting like it's not a concern. We have plans in place to make sure that those things are accounted for. And so if people, actually speak to their broker and then shop around a little bit, I think yes, there are times it's an issue, but there's also a lot of times that it's not an issue. And so, I don't think it should be the assumption that you're going to have an insurance issue. But it's something to definitely be aware of. I think you can definitely mitigate it by having plans in place when you talk to them of like, this is what the policy is going to be to make sure that people are safe.
Mhm.
It's sort of like having a plan first before you go. Like, okay, what kind of co-sheltering are we going to do? What are we doing to retrofit space in terms of materials, keeping families who don't have pets separate from families who do or individuals. I love what you said. You go in and say, here's all the things that we've already thought about, and and here's how we're going to mitigate that. Versus kind of just going in blind and saying, we need insurance because it's they're going to find reasons not to. That's so you give them the reasons to do it.
Marlene, if you see anything different, is that, I mean, because you brought up insurance, I'm curious if you've,
Sure.
because you said it's flipped, right? And you're seeing this really become an
Yeah.
issue. But for those that are, okay, yes, it's an issue and we're getting past it, have you seen anything else that's helpful?
So nationally, what we've learned, both from our grantees and then throughout the state, is the lawsuits that happen. The that's what tipped the coin over was the one or two lawsuits made it um, a challenge for the insurance companies to continue in that industry. And so what we've been doing, our insurance broker, we invite them to the property. We let them see where the pet's going to walk, where the pet's going to be kenneled, or where the people are, what the safeguards are, so that we're not only describing our policies and procedures, which are longstanding and Maggie's word evergreen. We're always adding new policies and new practices based on what we learn, but we invite them to come there. And we also invite them to make recommendations if they know on an industry level what we could do better. So it becomes a working relationship with our insurance broker, not a once a year renew
Mhm.
our
Okay.
policy
Yeah.
conversation. They become a part of our donors. They
Yeah.
become a part of our service family, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's been that way for 18 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
That was an interactive conversation about what else should we think about or what else can we do.
Right.
And so that's what we always recommend is don't, if you have to shop, but otherwise start with where your relationship already
Right.
exists.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, these are, and you're talking about things that are like long conversations over time too, right? So it's like you kind of
Mhm.
keep having these, you have to keep coming back to the same points and
Mhm.
it's never going to be flip the switch and everything's fixed, right? So, and I think, so I'm going to have y'all back for a part two because I think there's a lot more to cover that we're not going to get to today. But I want to just ask one more question before one more question that I want to ask. If you could ask funders or housing providers for one thing, if if there was one way that they could contribute to solutions here, what would you ask for?
It's not to use predatory practices for the pet rent, the pet deposits, the pets included in the permanent housing, because everything that we're talking about is a temporary situation, but the hope is that they'll go to a permanent situation. And the new changes in our country where pet deposits and pet cleaning deposits and pet rent are now skyrocketing. I've never seen them this high. So people are having to stay in shelter longer or make other decisions. Again, it's now a barrier to them going into permanent housing. And so I would hope that who funders become and who property managers are would consider a fair and just practice of pet rent, pet deposit, pet applications, all of those kinds of things. That would be my hope.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Marlene said. Like, we really need to see limits on pet deposits, especially pet deposits that aren't pet deposits that are actually fees that you don't get back,
Mhm.
and on the pet rents that are ridiculous. And but in terms of like funding for co-sheltering, I would love to see, just more funding going towards vet care. We have to follow municipal laws, right? So pretty much every municipality in this country is going to require rabies vaccinations and things like that. And so if we could get more funding on the vet side, that's what I hear from a lot of shelters is actually, aside from bites and those types of things, their biggest concern is, are these animals going to have their vaccinations? Are they going to have vet care? And that is something that people all over the country, whether you're experiencing housing insecurity or not, are struggling with, right? Vet care is expensive for everybody. So I would love to see more funding going towards, vet care for pets who are in situations like this. But then also just recognizing overall, like I said before, that it doesn't have to be that expensive. It really doesn't. But also maybe more funders who will give for like staffing, because it does work better if shelters have like some staff dedicated to making sure that everything is running smoothly on the pet side, depending on how many, people that you have in your program. And so, just in general, having more funding that can go towards staffing. We've seen really interesting things like California's PASS program, where it was a grant program that specifically paid for things like veterinary care and staffing for shelters in California. And it was an amazing program. And so I think New York, the state of New York has now introduced two bills that are going to hopefully create a similar program in New York. And so like even from, we think a lot of times of funders as foundations, but even from the government side, can governments, state governments provide similar type funding in other states that will help to pay for these programs?
I really like what you said about the veterinary care. We had a grantee who told us last week that they had a survivor come in with a pet who had, I forget what it's called, but it's like a tumor in the eye. It's a very expensive surgery, and they were able to cover it. And that's a life and death difference for the family. And the stories like that, they're so profound. And I think you're right. We have a lot of people who fund NOAAs who are not in, domestic violence or homelessness is not on their radar, but they are pet lovers.
Mhm.
So really finding out where to go for some of that funding.
And learning how to talk to each other too, right? Because animal welfare folks speak a completely different language than housing folks. I used to, after being in animal welfare for so long, I started going to this coalition that was all for housing where I was working and in the city where I was working. And I didn't understand anything that they were saying. They were like LIHTC this and all this stuff. I had no idea what they were talking about. Someone made me a glossary. Super helpful. And I almost think like we actually created some one pagers at My Dog Is My Home. That's like one of them is how to speak, if you're an animal welfare organization, how do you speak to homeless services? If you're homeless services, how do you speak to animal welfare partners? Because we're coming from such different worlds. A lot of it is similar and a lot of it we can relate to, but we're coming from different worlds. And so even just knowing how to have those conversations with each other is really important.
Yeah, I think you're all demonstrating this kind of linkage across the theme has come up several times, right? This linkage between the different people in different spaces and a lot of really good work being done, but how do we tie it together and kind of speak in a way that we can all agree on things?
But it just comes down to relationships and
Mhm.
partnerships. And that, that's something that Marlene and I have talked a lot to our grantees about is how do you build these partnerships? And so much of it is the language,
Yeah.
the vernacular of,
Mhm.
okay, how do I talk about it that it resonates in your world? So
Well, thank you so much. Anything that we didn't touch on? I know there's a lot we didn't touch on, but anything in particular that we didn't touch on that you'd like to make sure you put out there before we close it out?
I think I would just say, we already said it doesn't have to be that hard. There are successful models. Like, reach out to those organizations that are already co-sheltering successfully and ask them questions. Most of them are really happy to share their experience. My dog's my home. Like, we have open houses where people can actually come and tour these facilities and see what the policies are and ask the questions, and just I think when you actually talk to people who are doing the work, you see how possible it can be, and it stops being as scary.
There's so many models that are available, whether it's in the room, in a separate facility, a foster care, an offsite boarding. I mean, there's just so many answers to the question, how do we include the pets when people are in crisis? And so I love that there's more and more models that are being discussed and even yet to be invented. So thank you for having this conversation with us.
Yeah.
thank you, Russ.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's been fantastic, and I'm serious that there's probably a part two in the future here because I think there's other things to cover. Just quickly, can you just tell us where people can find your work? So, Shoshana, maybe just a website at least, if you could tell people where
Yeah,
that is.
absolutely. MyDogIsMyHome.org. And also, we have a conference every year. We would love to see people. Our next conference is in March 24th through 26th, this 2026. So we would love to have people join the conference. There's scholarships available. Sorry. So, definitely find us through our website, find us through our conferences, the Co-Sheltering Collaborative. We'd love to have people involved. That's a way that people can tangibly, like, actually take action with us to make
Okay,
changes in their own communities. So we'd love to
okay,
see you.
right. Thanks. And how about Noah's? Where should people go to find out about you?
We're on noahsanimalhouse.org. You can find us on Google. We're on Instagram active, showing pictures of pets. We'd love to interact with anybody.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and hope to see more of your great work. And we'll look forward to partnering. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so
Thank you for, and
much.
thank you for joining, everybody. All right. Bye bye.